this morning into week 2 of the Enough series. I want to shout out the online crew and the online team that's making that service happen. We appreciate you guys for being a part, and that's a big thing that God really has done in the last year, and certainly in the church, but also 828 Church. And every challenge that we face, Mr. Ron, it's interesting, but kind of the place I think at this point in my life where my heart goes, like my communication kicks to this. And I know there are so many ways that the Bible communicates what I'm about to say. But I probably have a unique language approach sometimes. I'm a little cliche, but here's what I believe. I believe God is God enough and good enough for everything we face. Come on, that's what I believe. I just believe He's God enough and He's good enough for all the different challenges and certainly disappointments, but also dreams that come true, because sometimes those can be a little overwhelming too, right? I mean, you've been to add a little one to the family, and come on, that's a dream you prayed to have happen, and pretty soon you're going to be praying for sleep, right? One prayer leads to another. That's how that works. Come on. And God is God enough and good enough for all of it. All of it. The dreams that come true and the ones that don't. But sometimes in that, I guess, bit of language, maybe the piece that gets a bit overlooked even in my own explanation, Miss Wanda, is that He's God enough. What could I possibly mean by that? Like, what does that even mean? So God enough and good enough. And I was thinking a bit as we were in this series called Enough, believing that God is enough for us and that He's made us enough and that His Word is enough. And sometimes He even has to say to us, that's enough, right? We're going to cover all those things. But today, as we kind of land into the reality of enough, I want us to consider what it means to think about God as being God enough. I don't know if you've ever tried to define God. It was an interesting weekly assignment for me that I drew in April of 2021 to try to go understand how to define God. In fact, the first bit of insight I will share with you is a part of what makes Him God is He's not easily defined. In fact, I don't believe that we can define Him. He's beyond our comprehension, but we're going to take a run at it anyway, and I tried to take as much advice and input from Him as possible, so we'll see how this goes. First of all, definition, I think, from Britannica. God, the originator and ruler, this is capital G God, too, by the way. Even in Britannica, I think that's amazing. So not little g God, but capital G God, the originator and ruler of the universe and source of all moral authority and justice. So there's a quick and simplistic, it doesn't cover it all, doesn't do justice even in regards to the justice, but the originator and ruler of the universe, that's pretty powerful. I'm impressed, right? Come on, somebody. And source of all moral authority and justice. Now, that's an important part about who God is as God, and understand the justice component. Here's the other piece of that we should add to that, and that is that He is the benevolent, thank you, Lord, somebody. He's the benevolent King of creation. If He wasn't a benevolent King, we would all be in big trouble. Because He has ultimate moral authority and justice. But He's also a benevolent, loving King, as it were. And another definition is this: the supreme being. The creator and ruler of all that is, the self-existent one, who is perfect in power, goodness, and wisdom. Wow. That makes me just want to skip over and read Psalm 97 that says the earth melts like wax under His feet. I mean, He's the supreme, right, being, creator and ruler. Self-existent, that's an important piece of this. One, and I didn't capitalize that, they did, who is perfect in power, goodness, and wisdom. The Jewish people used basically what is transliterated into 4 letters to describe God. They gave a kind of a first name, and I think was inspired by God to give the letters YHWH, which is referred to as a tetragrammaton. Sorry, that's a hard word to say. Tetragrammaton. I promised Ricky I'd say it today. But literally translates in English, we would say it this way. We would say Yahweh, right? Yahweh. And again, in fact, the Jewish people at some point in their history decided, and I think this might have been a little out of balance and possibly a little pharisaical, but kind of honor the reason that they thought this, but they felt like the name was too holy to say. So they wouldn't even say Yahweh. And the words like Elohim and Adonai started to be common in their language to describe God. Elohim, normally a name that would be reserved for a pluralistic God, but in this context, they mean Elohim, a singular God who was for all nations. So even the Jewish people who were chosen people understood that he was a God for all peoples. Elohim, God for all nations. And Adonai, which we would most often see translated as Lord, right? All these terms that they tried to use to describe God. I like Yahweh, I do. And then much, much later in the history of translations, you started to see the word Jehovah used, which was really just kind of a way also to say Yahweh, Yahuwah, Yahweh, Jehovah. Those are all attempts in the English to describe the indescribable, right? That tetragrammaton, that 4 consonants that you can't even pronounce because they have no verbs, YHWH, to describe, have no vowels, sorry, those are all consonants. I got plenty of correctors, man. I appreciate that. I would not want to go on with that. I would be watching the podcast later and be like, why no one correct me? Eddie's not here to help me out, so thank you, Chad. Yeah, no vowels. And I'm also impressed that you're paying attention. It's well done. Nehemiah, in an effort to describe this God that we speak about, Nehemiah in 444-ish BC gained his freedom to go back and rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. We actually had a series not too long ago. I mean, I guess it's been a year and something ago at this point, just about this rebuilding of the wall. And it was a seemingly insurmountable task. But Nehemiah was commissioned, he believed by Yahweh, to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem that were in ruins. Anybody sometimes just feel like we're called to be rebuilders? Not even just builders, but rebuilders. Like there's so much that's lost and broken in the world in regards to God, and there's work to do. And again, we did an entire series to that effect, but Nehemiah saw God work miraculously, and they did what seemed impossible in 52 days. One of the most fascinating things about the story of the rebuilding of the wall in Nehemiah is that it took 52 days. Isn't it amazing that often what we perceive to be impossible is not just possible with God. It's not even just probable with God. I mean, it's a done deal if we really believe that he is God enough. Come on, somebody. And good enough for what he's called us to and what the world needs from us for him. And then Nehemiah, after that, talking to the people and setting things in order, said this to God, about God. You're the one. You're the one. You're the one. God, you alone. You made the heavens of heavens, and all the angels, all the host, the earth and everything on it, the seas and everything in them. You keep them all alive. Heavens, angels, worship you. And there's so many things we could say about God. I'm just going to quick hit today because I'm going to be a bit of a storyteller this morning, and I want to make sure I leave myself the space to tell the stories God's given me to tell. But when, again, we think about God, I can't do justice to any of this, Chris, but I'll say this about him. He's eternal and infinite. That's one thing for certain. He pre-existed, and he is infinite. He is utterly independent, all right? Everything that isn't God depends on God. That's what I believe about God. And I understand everyone doesn't believe that about God. This is what I believe is so about him. Everything that isn't God depends on God. He's utterly independent, self-existent, if you will. He is eternal. He is infinite. In fact, Paul wrote in Colossians 1:17, he existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. So he was there before, and he's the one that's holding it together. In fact, it was St. Thomas Aquinas who didn't consider himself a philosopher, but certainly he was, and an amazing theologian and apologist who studied a lot from Aristotle. Got a lot of these ideas that I'm about to share with you, but it was Aquinas who said that he was the uncaused cause. And you'll hear that a lot from apologists. And I believe that. I do. That's what I believe about God. He was the uncaused cause. In fact, I would give you a takeaway that just simply says Yahweh is the uncaused first cause. He's sovereign. I mean, think about that. Like, he's sovereign. Meaning, again, independent and complete in his authority. We use words to describe him in the church, like the word omnipresent, which means he's always everywhere. Consider Psalm 139:7. Where can I go from your presence, O God? He is omniscient, right? 1 John 3:20, that essentially that passage ends with the reality that God knows everything. So he's omnipresent everywhere, and he's omniscient, knowing, all-knowing, knows everything. He's omnipotent, which means he's complete in power. He is all power. Get a little fired up. Woo, Psalm 115:3. The psalmist said, you do what you decide, because you're God. Right? He's sovereign. He's God enough. And this was probably maybe a characteristic of God that I love the most, is that, and I'll give you this in the form of a takeaway, he's both sovereign and merciful, but also simultaneously perfect in wisdom and love. That's an important combination. Somebody. Like if he was just sovereign but not merciful, again, I'll go back to the beginning here. If he wasn't a benevolent king, I don't know that I'd be here talking to you about him. I'm sure I'd be toast. So he's sovereign. I mean, we experience this on a different level. We're not really sovereign, but we might be walking through the hallway and see a spider or a bug, and we have the capacity and the power to determine whether the bug, unless it's a really fast bug, I suppose. Incidentally, I said a few weeks ago that Tyler was terrified of bugs. That's inaccurate. I owe Tyler an apology. I don't know who I was thinking about, but Tyler wasn't deeply offended, but he was at least shallowly offended. Man, you made me, I'm afraid of bugs. He's not afraid of bugs. Interesting factoid, though, about Tyler, since we're talking about Tyler. He's terrified of pickles. So if you happen to have a gherkin with you, please, chase Tyler. He'll be up here. But we have the ability when we see a bug, if we want, we could stomp it. We could, and I know a lot of you do. As merciful as me, I try to scoop them up and get them outside. Man, you better run for it. You better go. You better go. What if there are lots of different gods, but the ultimate God was only a stomper? Right? But it's not like that. We don't have 45 gods to appease. We have one merciful, loving Savior and King of creation, a benevolent God who is ultimate in authority, but is also limitless in the way that he loves us. He's God enough. Did I mention that? 1 John 4:8 says, he who does not love does not know God, for he is love. If there is a primary defining factor for us, it's that God is love. That's the most significant thing about him he wants us to understand, is his capacity to love. And he's God enough to decide what's best. I want to just throw that in there real quick. I want you to understand that that's true. And we'll get to that in a different piece of this series, but I think sometimes we say that like if it was a test and we were supposed to somehow tick a box. Is God able to decide for me? Does he have the capacity to know what's best for me? We would say yes, but again, honestly, we don't often live like we believe that's true. He is God enough to decide what is best. And I love that, like as a dad, our sons, Isaac, who I miss. Isaac and Audra live in Virginia and serve at Virginia Tech with a ministry that God allowed us to launch several years ago called Chi Alpha. And, of course, Jacob and Christy are here. They were singing together on the stage today, which was amazing. And, with the boys, one of the things we taught them in regards to honor wasn't that they could never have a question or a concern, but how they approach is important. Come on, parents, somebody. It's a big deal. And what would often be the case was we were making a decision about something to do, and I'm not as good at executing this as a papa as I need to be, but I was pretty good as a dad. And, depending on how they came, determined a lot about what input they had in the decision, but ultimately their ability to trust that dad knew best was a big deal. And earthly dads don't always. I'm going to be honest about that. I'm speaking specifically about our relationship, and certainly even in it, I often had to backtrack because I'm human. But I loved it when we would be talking about something and they would say, well, if we could do this, that would be great. But if not, right? It's whatever you think, Pops. I even got that from Jacob recently. I think I shared this story, but we were out looking at some land. We've been looking for land. We're trying to buy some land and ultimately build a house. Not the right time to build a house. Don't know if you noticed the price of 2x4s, but I digress. We'd still like to go ahead and acquire some land, have this dream of building a little village. I don't know if it'll come true, but we were out looking at some land, and it was incredibly thick. We were trying to get to this piece I could see on the GPS, Chris, that looked like it might have a place that would perk. It's tough to find good land around. I mean, we were 25 miles out. And there was a point when I was looking through the most unbelievable rough thicket-type bush, and Jake was like, well, it's almost dark, Pops. We probably should head back. I mean, we were pretty deep. I kept looking, and he said, but, I mean, if you want to do it, I'm with you. And we got just cut up by briars. We ended up in the dark. It took us forever to find our way out. I was leaning into things to try to get through. We were wet. We were lost, and we were loving it because we were together. But I appreciated the heart. And it reminded me of Jesus. And God's perfect in wisdom, by the way, and more than capable of deciding. How do you approach him in the way that your life lives and the decisions that are made for you and those you might impact with your decisions? Because Jesus, you know this, in the Garden of Gethsemane said, if it's possible, but if not. And he's so able to hear us. You think about some folks that talked out of turn. You could go to Job and consider all the poor advice that Job got going through an incredible crisis that none of us can imagine. But then when you get to Job 42, the last chapter of the book of Job, Job comes in humility. He was always humble before God. And he said, you asked me who it was speaking, and it was me. He said, it was me, but you are God. I mean, in Job 42, I don't have this in my notes, but 42, 2-6, somewhere in there. And then the irony is all those opposing voices that had given Job poor advice and told him he should curse God and die, etc., God said to them, humble yourselves and go to Job, because he was right and you were wrong, because he trusted me and you didn't, and ask him to bless you. And he did. But I think there's a place in us to know that God is God enough to lead us in this life. And my favorite thing, though, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say that way, but I just did. But I mean, the inexhaustible love of God's got to be the number one, I think, trait about God that makes him God. But I really love dominion over death. I am not going to lie. I am a fan of that. That is one of the God qualities that no one else has. And I just love dominion over death. It's just pretty kicking. That's a superpower right there. And only one guy got it. He's God enough. He even has dominion over death several years ago. In fact, when our aforementioned son Isaac, who's just 13 months older than Jacob, yes, that's really close. And yes, I did catch a little heat from Jacob's mom when she found out he was pregnant. But I'm not allowed to talk about that publicly. But we're so glad you are here. But Isaac, the aforementioned firstborn, when he graduated from college, he graduated the same day as a young man from our church in Virginia named Brandon Brinkley. But Brandon had been trying to graduate for years, but he was battling cancer. He fought cancer for a really long time. And kudos to his amazing wife, Lindsay, who just said, look, you're going to get this degree. And I'll never forget they graduated in the same graduation. So it was a large enough school where they had, smaller graduations all over campus. But those two guys were together, which was amazing. And we walked with Brandon through the end of his very short life. And I remember just dealing with the disappointment that he wasn't dramatically and ultimately miraculously healed here, but knowing that he was healed there. Amen. Come on, and he's not the only person, certainly in my life, that we've walked that out with, but he's probably the person that I wanted the most to see healed. I wanted so much to see this young man, a husband and a father, healed, and yet I know that in the end, the celebration of this young man's life, and then the redemption, even in his own wife's life and what God's doing with her and their family, that there's this place where we just believe that the dominion that God has over death isn't just physical, although that's a big deal. Eternity lasts a really long time. Somebody say, thank you, Jesus. But that even the pangs of death that are here cannot hold us. In fact, 1 Corinthians 15:55, Paul said this, "O death, where is your sting?" Have you ever stood before someone who'd suffered loss, or maybe you've stood beside a casket and you whispered those words? Because I have. I've stood by the casket of a 2-year-old Watch the father who worshiped God in the middle of his hurt. And I've whispered the words, "Oh, death, where is your sting? Oh, grave, where is your victory?" I watched my friend sing over his 2-year-old son's casket, and I can't imagine it. I don't even like to talk about it. But he walked in such an unbelievable grace that he sang at his own son's funeral. And I sat in the crowd, and I was a pallbearer, and then I did the graveside service, and I sat in that crowd, and I said this. I said, God, I went back to the disciples when Jesus walked on water, calmed the storm, and I said, what manner of man is this? That even death, the winds and waves of death, have to listen to him. And shifting in already toward the end, but going to take some time to tell you a couple of stories this morning before I'm done. And so April the 16th, so is today the 18th? Yeah, today's the 18th. So a couple of days ago, April the 16th, marked a horrific anniversary. I always wish there was some other way to say that, you know, when it's something that isn't good, but it marked the anniversary of the Virginia Tech shooting and massacre. And Karen and I and the boys, we were in Blacksburg and Christiansburg for a total of 13 years and worked as university ministry pastors at the aforementioned Chi Alpha Student Ministries, was what we pastored there, launched and pastored at Virginia Tech. And when we were there, though, you know, God did a lot of amazing things. I'll never forget the fall of 2005 was one of the most amazing ministry moments of my life. So we had like a house that we had rented just off campus early in the development of this ministry. We believed if you could have some place, right, where you could get students together. So it was like if you're familiar with any other student ministries like Campus Crusade or the BCM or any of those, you know, you like to have some sort of the Methodists have the Wesley Foundation. They usually have some sort of a facility. And incidentally, we have a big plan to launch university ministry through a partnership with Chi Alpha at UNCW this fall. So that's one of the things. Yeah, that's one of the things we're working on. Excited about that. But so we rented a house, and you know, we put students in it to kind of help pay for it, and also to create community. And then eventually we expanded, and we had another house across the way that was awesome. But before we had that. So we got in that house, and I was like, well, how can we justify this? And Karen, you know, is counting the money, and she said, you know, if we do this, we're going to end up, we're going to be paying the rent more than anyone else. And I said, I have this big idea that we could take the first house and turn it into the international house. Because at Virginia Tech, over 2,200 international students from over 100 countries, and we were extremely involved with international student ministry for our entire, you know, near 20-year career as university ministry pastors and directors and that kind of thing. And so I said, I got this big idea. We'll create a house, and we'll put international students in there that in many cases likely won't know Jesus, but we'll also put them in there with some American students. I think it's a great evangelistic strategy, and will be a blessing, and it'll help pay the rent. So we'll have both houses, because the second house was a better community center. The first one was a really cool residence. Plus we had a lease that we couldn't necessarily get out of. So we kept them both. And man, it was working. We were filling it up. We had only one room left. And I remember this particular day in the fall of 2005, I was getting ready to go speak at a chapel at a local Christian school that our sons attended. And just as I was late, I stayed in a meeting a little too long. It was close, but I was going to be late for chapel. And I just walked out, and there were there was a Chinese couple walking down the sidewalk, the International Student Center on campus. We were right on the corner, so they were very close to us. And they're like, excuse me. And, you know, are you Ron Bernard? Yes, I am. We want to see the room. And I was like, I'm really pushing it here. I got to be somewhere. But the gentleman said, but I must catch a flight. And this is my wife. And I have to leave today. I have to go back to Canada. That's where he was studying. But I need to find her a place. We're very desperate. And so I text the guy I was going to do chapel for, Doug Hampton, who may be watching this morning. And I said, I'm going to be late. And I went and showed him the room in the house. And, you know, they were excited. And so, yes, we'll take it. And so Hai-Yan Chang moved into this Chi Alpha house, this ministry center. And Hai-Yan, she told us early in the conversations, look, my father in China, I'm very curious about you guys, but my father in China tells me not to come to America and be brainwashed. right, by Christianity. And she had been in the States for a while. She had already gotten an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in Canada. And so she had been this side for a minute, but I think she just felt sort of obligated to give me a quick heads up, don't try to convert me. And I said, okay, it's fine. We'll just love, getting to help you and love you. But she was very inquisitive. And we did a Bible study. Two of the ladies in the house, Annabelle and Kim, led a Bible study that was basically conversational English. And Hyen needed to work on her English very much to be an instructor, which is what she was going for. So she got in that study, and she was very curious about God. She asked great questions, Susan, like, why Christians have so many versions of the Bible? Are they confused? Or why so many denominations? Can't Christians get along? Great questions, easy answers. We're not confused, but, there are a lot of ways to translate this. There's only one way to interpret it, by the way, but lots of ways to translate it. And, yes, we struggle to get along, so guilty as charged. And she had some other more difficult questions that they would bring to me. And they were feeling very overwhelmed. Annabelle and Kim were like, what do we do? And I said, well, don't answer a question you don't know the answer to. That's my first piece of advice. And then about 5 weeks into that fall semester, just 5 weeks into that fall semester, we did our word and worship services on Wednesday night. We met in the Memorial Chapel right off the drill field at Virginia Tech. And about 5 weeks in, I'm getting ready, worship guys warming up or whatever. I'm getting ready to preach in a little bit to some students, and then Hyen walked in. I was not ready for Hyen to walk in. I did not, either the Holy Spirit did not give me a heads up or I was not listening. And I don't really want to debate that while I'm trying to preach with him. But I did not know she was coming, and I didn't feel like I had a message for her. So I joke that I was literally sitting on the front row of the chapel, flipping through my Bible looking for a message for I just got here from China, right? Which wasn't exactly true, but, I'm from communist China. I don't know God. And I couldn't find one. And that particular day just wasn't good enough to move on from the message I had, so I just preached it. And it kind of had some old school country colloquialisms built in. I was telling stories about my grandma and how her favorite hymn, this girl didn't even know what a hymn was. Her favorite hymn was Learning to Lean on Jesus. And I just went ahead and preached it. I didn't have a choice. And Hyen was sitting, there were wooden pews in that chapel, and she's sitting back about where Chris is right now, maybe Jay, only they were straight rows, and she's sitting on the edge. And while I'm preaching, I'm telling you, she kept looking at me like, I don't know. And I'm used to getting that look from Karen, but it's tough when you're preaching. It really is. Not Karen Kress. Right? I'm just like, and I would try to explain it. And I even at one point said, look, if you're listening to me today and these things just do not make sense to you or you have a further question, please ask me for coffee. I'll be happy to talk to you about it further. But then I got to the end, Laura, and I'm talking about how my grandma's favorite hymn was Learning to Lean on Jesus and what leaning on Jesus, trusting in Jesus looked like. And she started to cry. And I was like dumbfounded. I'm like talking to God. I always joke out the back of my head, and I'm still preaching out the front of my face. But I'm doing two things. I'm multitasking. I'm like, how can this is not possible. What is going on right now? How are you doing this? She just got here with us, and she doesn't have a history with you. And then, I felt like the Lord said, you have no idea about the history I have with her. Okay. I've been pursuing her heart since before she was born. That's fair. You think I'm limited to now and here? I'm God enough. That's right. For people in communist China. Ecclesiastes, he's put eternity in their hearts. Come on, somebody. And I gave a response. She came straight to the front. I was sweating. I couldn't believe or breathe. I was like, oh my word, what do I even do? And she said, can I pray? And I said, yes. And I'm praying with her, but I'm really not saying anything. I know that's hard to believe. And she said, God, I'm so glad you bring me here. Introduce me to these people so they can introduce me to you. So sorry I did not know you before. If you help me now, I'll live the rest of my life for you. And then she said, can I pray in Mandarin? think I said yes. I did the best I could to get a yes over the lump in my throat. And it was just a beautiful thing. She got involved in a local church. Eventually, she had a daughter that was living with a husband in Canada. Eventually, they got visas, came also to Blacksburg. They all three gave their hearts to Jesus and got baptized on the same day. That was about the time, though. That was our last year at Virginia Tech. And in May of 2006, Karen and I relocated for 2 years. We would come back, but we relocated for 2 years to be state directors for that same student ministry in Arkansas. And then on June the 16th, 2007, a young man who was really broken walked in to a dormitory and shot 2 people, and then walked into Norris Hall, chained the doors from the inside, and went on a shooting spree that would take the lives of 30 other people, students and professors who all have names and faces and stories. And we were in Arkansas already, but ironically, I was getting ready to do a wedding for the aforementioned Kim and her husband Nils, and so I was coming to Blacksburg on the Monday of the shooting. But on Sunday, I had been hit by a truck the year before, and I often had very inconsistent kind of physical way I was feeling, and on Sunday, I was feeling so sick that I actually moved my flight. I didn't fly in on Monday. That's hard for me, I was saying earlier, because I was going to be meeting Kim downtown, and Cho, after he shot 2 people, walked downtown and went into the post office and mailed his tapes to NBC News, and he was already packing, and he was in the post office just before 9, and I was supposed to be having breakfast at 9 across the street, and Millie, the postal clerk, was someone I had become good friends with, and anytime I came to town, I would go visit her, and I always felt like I would have been standing in the queue with Cho, and maybe I would have seen that there was something suspicious. Maybe the story would have changed. I mean, that's how personal this is to me. I've long processed that with God, but it's just the whole thing. And so on that Monday when the shooting happened, of course, I'm getting contacted. We've not been gone, that long, over a year. I did, in fact, get on a plane. Forget I don't feel good. I got on a plane and flew in immediately. And then on Tuesday, I actually got word that Hyen was teaching at Norris Hall the day of the shooting. And there was a lot of moving parts, but I got a text from her saying, hey, I'm okay. I want you to know I'm okay. And God protect me. And so then we ended up talking, and she told me some things. She said, Ron, you not believe how this went down. She said, I was in the classroom, and teaching only had 10 students. She was actually subbing for the actual professor who was out of town that day, and I was teaching. I was moving on to another subject. I just finished one thing, and we kept hearing this boom, 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 boom. And it sounded like some construction work, but it was getting closer. So a girl on the front row said, that doesn't sound like construction. And so she went, and as she went to look out, I went with her, and we put our heads out the door. And the shooter, she was in room 205, came from 207 across the hall. And she said, we realize he's pointing a gun. Maybe a couple of bullets fly by because our ears are hurting. It's so loud. I mean, it's a narrow, narrow hallway. We run back in and scream, and a couple of students say, let's block the door, and they grabbed a long table. A couple of young men grabbed a long, heavy wooden table and shoved it against the door. And the shooter came and started shooting. Hyen says she ducked behind the podium, and one of the bullets it was a stick podium, hit the podium, and splinters flew around. But the young men were able to hold it. He shot through the door, but the table was heavy, and they were able to hold it. He came back several times and tried to get in. It was the only room in the area where the shooting took place that he never was actually able to enter. And no one in the room was injured. And I don't believe that that's just the favor of the Lord for her and them, but I'm thankful that my friend was spared. I know God was fighting for everyone, including the heart of Cho, until he took his own life. Crazy story, amazing story. Got a call from Hyen about, I think, Thursday. She said, Ron, you don't believe this. Now, I'm exhausted. I've been meeting with students and friends. There's been a candlelight vigil and prayers. I'm sure you guys were there, Chad. There was so much going on that week, and there was no sleep. I was staying with Coach Doug. I stayed at his apartment, and just constant ministry, and personal heartbreak. The president was on campus. The governor was on. So many things were happening that week. And then I get this call from Hyen. She said, Ron, you not believe this, but I tell my whole story. And she said, all of Chinese news media hear my story. And they're broadcasting it. And I was underimpressed, I suppose. I said, that's awesome, Hyen. That's really great. She said, no, you don't understand. Actually, she said, you not understand. I tell my whole story. How I come to America, I become a Christian. And how my God protect me. Now all China can hear what my God does for me. I said, okay, that's amazing. No longer underimpressed. It's not the first or the last time Hyen made me cry. Let's get together on Sunday. I want to meet your husband. I'd never met him. So we got together at Starbucks. We met and chatted, and Hyen, he told me how it was for him trying to get in touch with her. There was more details about the story than made it. I mean, you can Google Hyen and watch this story on YouTube right now. It's still up. I emailed her last night. I watched it again last night. But they were telling me details that weren't in any of those news stories. And then she said, but Ron, this is not all. And I'm thinking, what else can there be? And she said, yesterday, it would have been Saturday, she said, my father contacts me, and he says, the family wants to speak with you. And they got on video chat, or speakerphone, actually, pre-video chat, but they got on speakerphone. She said, my father says, now her father, who says, don't go to America and be brainwashed by Western civilization, Christianity, whatever. My father says, we all see your story and your testimony, how your God protects you. Probably didn't call it a testimony, but we see your story, how your God protects you. And we all too believe we should believe in Jesus. And Hyen got to pray with her whole family. Nothing will ever make that shooting okay, but come on, somebody. I mean, God was working in the heart of every human that was there whose life was lost. In the last moments of their breath, he was giving them an opportunity to choose forever with him. And he was sticking it right back in the devil's face because he's God enough and good enough for everything. In fact, a primary takeaway for us today, and CJ is going to join me on the stage, is this: God is God enough, and he is good enough to lead us and love us through every season and circumstance, now and forever. That's your big takeaway from today, and it's true. He's enough. Come on, somebody. He's enough. That's a great story. But what about me? Well, he's also never changing. I'll give you another attribute about God. He's never changing. Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday. Come on, we could tell 100 stories from the Bible and we wouldn't even scratch the surface. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And in fact, Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 8, 5 and 6, he said this: there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created and for whom we live, and there is one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things were created and through whom we live. One. There may be many. I read the wrong passage. They're both really good. I'm going to read this one for you off the screen. There may be many so-called gods, both in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords. But for us, right, we worship the one and only true. That's what he went on to say to the Corinthians, the one and only true God. And one last story. Let me just tell one last story, and then I'll be done. There's a story of a lady that was a British missionary named Gladys Aylward. And Gladys came from a relatively impoverished family in England. And she actually worked as a maid. Like, that's what she did for a living, and it took her into her 30s. She wanted to serve through China Inland Mission, but wasn't given approval because of her lack of an ability to, she didn't have a big education. And so they didn't even really give her an opportunity to learn Mandarin. It was a difficult language to learn. I should know. And Gladys saved up money being a maid until she was in her 30s, and then she got herself, I mean, it's an incredible story. She traveled on the Trans-Siberian train, and she went across Russia, where she was at one point a captive. She finally made it all the way to the location that she wanted to serve, Yangqing, China in the 30s, and she started to work with a lady that she had corresponded with that had essentially started a hotel. There's actually a movie with Ingrid Bergman about this hotel. And they served travelers and talked to them about Jesus. It was a way they could do that. And then ultimately, though, they took in lots of orphans and they started an orphanage. And Gladys just adopted a litany of different children. Well, in 1938, the Japanese invaded that part of China. If you're familiar with the wars, there were two. And the Japanese invaded that part of China, and so she gathered up 100 of these kids and started this 100-mile trek to some other area of free China through the mountains, and she's trying to get these kids there. But it was just an insurmountable task. And at one point, they slept out essentially in the wilderness, and at one point she just felt so discouraged. Her heart got so heavy that she just believed they couldn't make it. And she was clearly despondent. And there was a 13-year-old, one of her students that had been with her for several years, who reminded her, but Miss Gladys, you're always, one of our favorite stories is the story of Moses leading the children out of Israel out of Egypt and being at the Red Sea. And God made a way. And Gladys said to this faith-filled 13-year-old, yeah, but I'm not Moses. To which the 13-year-old said, right, but he's still Yahweh. Last scripture, Romans 1:8. I am the Alpha, Jesus said of himself, and the Omega, the beginning and the end, says the Lord. I am the one who is. Right now, God is God enough. Right now. I am the one who always was. In other words, I always have been. Always have been. I am the one who presently is. I'm the one who always has been and who is still to come. Or in other words, always will be. Always will be enough. I'm the great or almighty one. Come on, somebody. How great is our God? How amazing is our Yahweh, our Savior and our friend? And I'm just going to leave you with this. God is God enough. And he is good enough for you and I today.